Okay, picking up where we left off. This trade between the frontier and the eastern settlements brings us to the next point. Hunting and warfare were not the only things that kept these men away from home for long periods of time. For instance, cattle were raised in the Carolinas and Western Virginia to be marketed in Baltimore for export to the West Indies. And moving cattle through the backcountry of Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland to Baltimore was a lengthy trip. Cowpens, South Carolina, wasn't named out of idle fancy. It was a gathering place for the Carolina herds before the drive began. Christopher Gist's exploration of Ohio in 1750 and 1751 and Boone's of Kentucky in 1775 are also examples of extended non-hunting trips. While members of their parties hunted to subsist, the primary purpose of Boone's trip was to explore the land for Judge Richard Henderson's Transylvania colony scheme, while Gist had been doing the same thing for Governor Dinwiddie's Ohio Company. Both men were acting as hired agents of a land company. They were not merely gone a-hunting, and they certainly were not out aimlessly roaming around looking for adventures. In bringing up exploration on behalf of various land companies, we touch on the single most important factor in the life of the Longhunter: land. Those who have been brought up on frontier fiction tend to think of the Longhunter only in terms of his forest environment, going through life alone and dependent on no one but himself, living off the land but never owning so much as a handful of it. While he may have had trouble getting clear title to the land he was on at any, trouble getting clear title to the land he was on at any given time, and while it may have been easier for him to move on and claim another piece, the primary reason he was on the frontier to begin with was to acquire land. Let me digress a bit. In 18th century America, there were basically three ways of acquiring land available to the common man: buy it outright, become a tenant farmer, or move out beyond the current established claims and establish his own claim. Buying was usually well beyond his means. I have already mentioned that it was rare to find a man who could live solely from the profits of his hunting, but Henry Fry was such a man. He made somewhere between 200 to 250 pounds, I believe, from his hunting, which he used to purchase a tract of land on the Upper Capone. But he was the exception rather than the rule. Tenant farming was common, but a lease was necessary to ensure tenure. With a carefully drafted lease, it was possible to hold land for 100 years or more, but such legal maneuverings were often beyond the ken of an uneducated farmer, and without a lease, the renter could be evicted without notice. Small wonder the vast expanses of unclaimed, or at least unattended, land to the west beckoned to so many. The seemingly preferred method of land acquisition for those we call Longhunters was the tomahawk improvement, a land claim based on registering natural and man-made landmarks. A means of solidifying one's claim, short of actual occupancy, was to make some form of improvement to the land, usually in the form of a corn patch. This was a practice not confined to the Longhunter. For example, George Washington claimed a piece of land that was also claimed and improved by Michael Cresap before Washington could establish firm rights to it. Straightening this out caused Washington considerable legal trouble, first with Cresap and later with his heirs. In fact, when tomahawk rights overlapped, which happened more often than not, the resulting confusion was often resolved by one man buying the other man's claim, in essence, paying for the improvements which Washington attempted to do with Cresap. Lacking the money or the inclination to spend it on buying out another, the dispute might have been settled in a more physical manner. Doddridge recorded one method of resolving such a dispute. When annoyed by the claimants under those rights, they deliberately cut a few good hickories and gave them what was called in those days a laced jacket. That is a sound whipping. But even if forced to move on, a man was still better off than if he had been evicted from a tenantship. At least he hadn't had to pay rent on the land he had occupied. In any case, it was the prospect of becoming a landowner that drew men to the frontier. Obtaining wealth, or at least making a living by trapping or trading in furs and buckskin, was secondary. The dream of owning great expanses of land escaped most of them, and even those who were successful in claiming land may have had difficulty keeping it. The Boone and George Rogers Clark using it to pay their creditors, or losing it in the courts to land speculators, lawyers, and politicians. But the idea of living a wild, free, adventurous life is a product of 19th century romanticism and would strike most frontiersmen as a lot of foolishness. They were there to make a home for themselves and their families. Family life is often overlooked when discussing Family life is often overlooked when discussing the Longhunter. Though it was very important to him, this is one of those areas where the gulf between 18th and 21st century values widens considerably. In 18th century America, all but the most degenerate had a keen sense of what he would call duty. Industry in working and hunting, bravery in war, candor, honesty, hospitality, and steadiness of deportment, along with raising a family, were all part of one's duty. And a man or woman who failed to marry and raise a family was not merely considered odd, but remiss in his or her duty. Raising a family. The perpetually single individual and the intentionally childless couples, which are becoming so common in our time, would probably be social outcasts 200 years ago. That's my lot. I do okay as an outcast. Longhunters were not social outcasts or misfits. Backwoods society may have been crude and uncouth by European or even by higher class American standards, but it was theirs. They lived by its rules, and one of the most important rules was to establish and raise a family. Marriage was not the affair of the heart that it became in the following century. It tended to be more practical than romantic. A man wanted a woman who would keep his house in order and bear his children. A woman wanted a man who would provide a home, food, and protection. Affection might exist between them. They may even be genuinely in love, but that was only a deciding factor when all else was equal. It was much more important that something substantial remain after any initial passion cooled. Among the upper classes, there were also matters of advancing, or at least maintaining, one's social and financial status, but these were of little concern on the frontier. Doddridge observed there was no distinction of rank and very little of fortune. On these accounts, the first impression of love resulted in marriage. This may seem to contradict the previous few sentences, but I believe that he was trying to get across was the spontaneity of the match. Frontier rank and fortune being roughly equal, the first impression of love was all a couple needed to decide the issue. In this light, it is easier to understand why it was not unusual for a person who lost a spouse to remarry within a few months, sometimes weeks or even days. Children were essential both to the family and to the community. They were what made the community grow and prosper, and they were perhaps the individual's single most important contribution to both. Children were considered assets not unlike servants or cattle, and the rearing of them was geared toward making productive adults of them as quickly as possible. Isn't that something? Not only were they much needed help in the home and on the farm, but they were their parents' future, someone to care for them if they should survive to old age and to carry on after they are gone. Doddridge went on to say that children, especially sons, were of great importance, as we were few in number and engaged in perpetual hostility with the Indians, the end of which no one could foresee. Indeed, many of them seemed to suppose that war was the natural state of man, and therefore did not anticipate any conclusion of it. Every big son was therefore considered as a young soldier. Let's see what we have. Oh, we'll keep going. This need for many new young soldiers shows that once having established a family, a man not only had to provide for them, but he had to protect them as well. But even an entire family armed to the teeth would stand little chance against a determined Indian attack. So some form of community defense was necessary. This defense was usually afforded by forts of size and construction, ranging from a small, privately owned blockhouse to the massive stone or tabby-walled forts built in garrison by armies to exert control over the territory with regard to other countries and Indians. In between are the forts usually called stations, built by the local citizenry for their own routine defense, and garrisoned by a militia, if at all. It was usually the latter that served the frontiersman and his family as a home away from home during Indian raids. Although there was really no standard construction method stations were usually built in the shape of a large rectangle with either two blockhouses in corners diagonally opposite one another, or four blockhouses, one in each corner. The stockade would enclose several cabins to serve as lodgings for the families taking refuge therein, a corral for the animals, and if at all possible, not always, a source of water. This entire chapter has only made a minor scratch on the surface of what life on the 18th century American frontier encompassed. I hope I have given you a sufficient broad brush picture to begin with, but as I already mentioned, the details of your own chosen time and place I must leave to you to learn from your own research. Good hunting. Love you. God bless.